Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero. AJ here with a short discussion of what Mark IV of Warmachine, just Warmachine now that Hordes has been rolled into the Warmachine brand, what Mark IV of Warmachine has on the horizon for lorehounds, and those of us who want to know any and all about the Iron Kingdoms, Imoran, Cain, and the stories told within the many interesting places found there. I'm sure many of you have already listened to the latest Primecast, link in the description, and of particular note are some comments made by Matt Wilson in the opening segment concerning the upcoming companion app, the successor to WarRoom 2 for Mark III and the original WarRoom for Mark II. That the app is completely free for gameplay and models rules purposes is great. But what's even better is that for a subscription of $5 a month, there's what has been termed premium content, which will be akin to what we had in the 73 issues of No Quarter and 6 issues of No Quarter Prime. As a segue into nostalgia, No Quarter was a great magazine and a source of a lot of my research material for the content you see on this channel. However, more than just lore and fluff, there are articles on painting guides, converting models, community initiatives and showcases, models previews, and gameplay supplements in the form of narrative scenarios for Warmachine and Hordes, often with a short story attached. Anything IKRPG related as well, which was invariably good for both players and DMs, and so on and so forth. Needless to say, it was a pity to see it go, but one may assume that money talks, and the magazine in its form as it was, a physical magazine or digital download released once every 2 months, didn't sell well enough to warrant its continuation. Specific to lore, however, there was rarely an issue which went by without at least one short story whose central characters were impossible to predict as far as the game's factions were concerned. And I doubt any reader of NQ can forget the Gavin Carl files, which offered an in-depth, in-world look at specific characters who spanned the full breadth of the setting, from humans to dragons, from simple servant in one faction to another faction's leader, and even, in an amusing subversion, the mysterious Gavin Carl himself. I and every other reader have lists a mile long of characters we'd like to see receive the Gavin Carl treatment. Similarly, if to a lesser extent, Forces of Distinction was another fun regular entry, and it was interesting to see the community discuss list building options and counterplay against the new tier list. Naturally, for me, it was more about the short story which accompanied the tier list, which provided a backdrop of how that tier list came to be in-world, something themes in Mark III haven't really succeeded in replicating, though I acknowledge the difficulty in doing so given the breadth of the game's roster of warcasters and warlocks. The one you see on screen now is Kalissa's Force Wall, the first tier list I purposely bought and built minis for, and whose short story was the first bit of IK-related fluff I read, and repeatedly at that, when it first got released. And so that it doesn't feel left out, across the 2 editions of IKRPG which the publication run of NQ spanned, that game was never left out. Pendrake Encounters became something to look forward to as I got more back issues, along with the various article series which added to gameplay variety, equipment, character customization options, NPCs, setting locations, and what have you. Uncharted remains one of my favourite serialised IKRPG article series for how much could be added to the depth of a campaign. And one last feature I'll gush over is the Iron Kingdoms Archives series, which it was a little inconsistent in terms of how often it turned up, but it was brilliant. It took a Keystone event theme or a year in world and broke it down into several dozen short entries of noteworthy occurrences. Dragons, the Orgoth, the years of war and occupation among the rival Iron Kingdoms. It was all engrossing stuff. So, what does this all mean for WarRoom 3 subscription content? Well, honestly, I haven't the faintest idea what it will feature beyond abstract points based on what Matt Wilson said. There will be lore and fluff. And to be quite frank, I was sold on it with just that. Thus, all I can offer at this stage is a wish list with varying degrees of general consensus. While it is unlikely that the subscription content will directly replicate the regular articles from No Quarter, in a manner similar to how No Quarter Prime had few direct equivalents as well, I think a few analogous pieces will be there, most of all in terms of short stories, which will be the same irrespective of format, merely being a matter of length. That said, a part of me hopes we might get a serialized novel or novella to serve as an ongoing narrative. infuriating though it might be having to wait a month for the next couple of chapters. Broadly speaking though, I'm hoping for 3 forms of monthly-ish content which caters to us lorehounds. Firstly, Warmachine supplements with one-off narrative scenarios and some accompanying fiction which expands into a faction or army's background, which would be especially relevant given the changes coming to the game and the setting. Secondly, straight fiction, of which the serialized novel is but one idea bouncing around my head. Ideally, there'd be more, such as the Gavin Carl files or Iron Kingdom's archives, as mentioned before, and while I won't expect it, I'd certainly welcome such content, should it arrive in a slightly more unfamiliar form. That was 2 points for the sharp head, along with a couple of honorary mentions, because the third was originally IKRPG supplements, which would provide new equipment, further world building, and new NPCs to rub shoulders with, or lock horns with as appropriate, or a one-shot campaign, etc. But all that said, because the app is a companion for Warmachine specifically, I don't actually genuinely believe IKRPG material will be released on it, even if I personally wouldn't mind it. Instead, the actual third item I'd like to see is a return of something a la Guts and Gears, an extensive showcase of a unit or a group of related units which are associated with each other in the world, such as Exemplars, Banes, Mage Hunters, and so on. A few tactical tips for use on the tabletop, and an article which details their history, equipment, hierarchy, and strategic function in world, along with brief accounts of battles or wars in which they played a notable part in. That would be something many, no doubt, would look forward to. More specifically to the overarching and ongoing plotline of the Warmachine game world, I, and know a few others out there, want the resolution of quite a lot of storylines, which remain varying levels of incomplete. Mild spoilers pretty much until the end of the video for those who haven't read Oblivion, the Hedgehog Scrolls, or the IKRPG Requiem books. So what was told in the Scrolls was only partially continued in the IKRPG Requiem material, and a lot is still left which deserves either continuation or a definitive conclusion at the very least. Some of this will come in the form of further Requiem expansions. For example, I expect the political fallout of their defeat at the hands of the Retribution of Syra, led by Gorshade prior to his demise, to be addressed in a future expansion, which explores and revolves around the Scorn Empire. Mercator of House Balash would presumably have a tricky 5 years after seeing the Scorn driven back across the Abyss and remnant elves set up shop in the Abyssal Fortress. Moving on, there's of course the small elephant in the room, that is to say, what year exactly does the Orgoth invasion occur? Relevant to them, what is their homeland and native culture like beyond the obvious? How are the Trollbloods doing down in the Elkier subcontinent, and are they getting along with their neighbours, the Croaks? What has Tristan accomplished with his new Ichthia down in Zoo, and what does that mean for Zooey's involvement in Imri's affairs? A question which becomes even more relevant when the Orgoth show up. Also, what's Agathon been up to, and what are the Magnatorium going to do about the disappearance of Zartaroth? On that note, even Iron Mother's sacrificing herself into the void notwithstanding, beyond what is mentioned in IKRPG Requiem, what has become of the Convergence? If not necessarily the cult itself, but its leadership. Is Orion boss now? And is Syntherian still clanking about? Slightly related to him, with Kruger's death, who's going to be Dalakov's headache now? And just how grumpy was Massar when he learned Kruger died at Henchhold? Speaking of Henchhold, how is Cynthia doing? Since she's presumably grown up now, and has she fully inherited Ace from her old man? Alternatively, was she seduced back to Lich Lord Denegra's side and the War Witches? Insert dramatic shrug here. And all this leaves out my ongoing focus on the Iosans, for whom there is a similar number of questions, i.e. a veritable truckload, all of which, as yet, have no answers. While some of these questions will no doubt be answered in Privateer Press's insider articles and other materials as well, whether as lore articles or short stories, I hope at least a fair majority will be given some sort of treatment in the new app subscription content. Given the sheer quantity of characters within the setting, many of whom aren't even playable, it would be unreasonable to expect focus on all of them. But we can still hope for those we have formed some sort of attachment to over the years of playing Warmachine and Hordes and IKRPG. However, one last modest request. A full biographical novel about Ares, pretty please. And what about everyone else? I'm curious to know what others want from this content offered with a subscription to the new, upcoming War Room.